This is my 33rd video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part is the 7th, dealing with my 3rd layout, to be made using mainly Hornby EZ Track. See the prior video, part 27, for my reasons for wanting to try a Hornby EZ Track layout when I already had an OO gauge layout using Bachmann EZ Track. This part deals with further work on my Hornby layout, specifically ballasting and weathering the track. This was where I got to at the end of my last video. Other than the area where the turntables intended to go, the track was all pinned down over either cork or rapido roadbed, so the next step was ballasting. I must admit that this is a task I hate. I'm just not comfortable with making such a mess all over my track, and I'm always afraid that I'll end up stopping things functioning either by messing up electrical contact or by causing trains to derail. I also find this kind of task that involves a lot of bending over the board difficult and painful, as I have a bad back. Nevertheless, I felt that I really had to ballast the track on this layout. I made up a mixture of ballast which I thought might be a good idea, though in hindsight I don't think it was the best idea. A similar approach worked quite well on my N-gauge layout, where I was trying to match the ballast to the built-in track bed on my Kato track. Here I mixed 2 cups of Woodland Scenic's coarse grey mix with 1 cup of coarse cinders, and then I added 1 cup of fine grey mix and half a cup of fine cinders. If I were starting again with this layout, I think I'd just use coarse or possibly medium brown ballast. Anyway, this was what I used this time. I'd also bought a plastic ballast spreader on eBay, the little sort of box thing with a ramp for dispensing the ballast. I used the ballast spreader to spread the ballast over an area of the track. I started with a head shunt, as this was straight and at the front of the board, and so the easiest to work with. The ballast spreader basically worked. It did indeed spread ballast continuously over the track as it was moved. It has sort of little grooves in the bottom that fit over the rails, and you just sort of put it on the track and put ballast into it and move it along, and the ballast comes out the bottom. The problem with it was that it tended to put way too much ballast between the tracks, where really only a little was needed to go between the sleepers, and it didn't put much ballast beside the tracks, where I needed more to fill in over the shoulders of the roadbed. So I ended up constantly struggling to remove ballast from over the sleepers between the tracks and to add ballast over the shoulders. I also, predictably enough, made an unnecessary problem for myself. When I tested the head shunt track after initially laying down the ballast, I found that the engine almost derailed at the end of the head shunt. It turned out that this was nothing to do with the ballasting, but rather because there was a bad rail join there that I'd failed to spot in my previous testing. So I had no choice but to remove the ballast from that end section, take up that end piece of track and refit it properly. Then I had to put ballast down on that section again. After redoing the laying of the ballast and retesting, I glued the ballast for this section, spraying it with alcohol to wet the ballast thoroughly and then applying watered down white glue with a little detergent in it with a pipette. Most guides I'd seen suggested a mixture of 50-50 white glue and water, but I found that I needed at least twice as much water to white glue in order to get a mixture that was fluid enough. I tried mixing some brown paint in with the glue mixture in an attempt to tone down the colour of the ballast, but this didn't seem to actually achieve anything much. I went ahead and applied ballast to the other end of the outer sidings. I avoided the points completely in this initial ballasting process. They have to be ballasted more manually, separately afterwards. After the glue had set overnight, I tested the initial section again. It did basically work, as I was able to run a loco over the track quite smoothly. However, I became aware of another problem at this point. Track A in this picture is part of the outside loop, which is constantly supplied with power. Track B is the main outside siding line leading down to the two sidings at the left end of the board. Track C is the head shunt. There is a separate switched power feed for the head shunt at point P. You can see the wires coming down under the board there. I had assumed that power would never be passed from track A to track C, regardless of how the points 1 and 2 were set. With both points 1 and 2 set to turn, I expected power to pass from the outer loop to track B, but I didn't see how power could ever be passed from the outer loop to track C. I also showed this arrangement to Nigel with British Model Trains, and he also thought that power would never pass from the outer loop to track C. However, in practice, I found that if point 1 was set to turn, power indeed did pass through to track C. This was not what I wanted, since it meant that if I had a train parked in the head shunt and then tried to run another train across the points from the outer loop to the outer sidings, or the reverse from the outer sidings back to the outer loop, then the train parked on the head shunt would also move, even when the power feed to the head shunt was turned off. In retrospect, I think the point at 2 has got to be some sort of, it was a used point. Some of the points I bought were new, some were used, and I think that point at 2 is some sort of oddball point. It's not a standard Hornby point, because it seems to behave like the Bachmann points, that power is passed in all directions all the time once it gets power. It won't get any power unless point 1 is set to turn, right? Because the power won't come down from the outer loop and to point 2 unless point 1 is set to turn. But as soon as point 1 is set to turn, point 2 just seems to dispense power both to tracks B and C in both directions. And that's just not normal for a Hornby point, I don't think. So it's some sort of oddball point. Anyway, this was a problem that I needed to fix. Fixing this wasn't entirely simple. For one thing, I'd already ballasted the head shunt and glued the ballast down. And even disregarding this, I had the power feed to the head shunt at P, the joint between the point and a long straight section. There was nowhere ahead of this to create an isolation between the point and the head shunt. If I wanted to solve the problem through insulated rail joiners, I would have had to insulate the join at P and then move the power feed right down to the other end of the head shunt, which would have involved basically ripping up the whole head shunt. Rather than doing this, and ripping up all the ballasted track and redoing the wiring, I just used a rotary tool to cut one of the rails at point C. This stopped power passing from the point to the head shunt, meaning that power would only get to the head shunt when the feed at P was turned on, and put me back where I wanted to be, with power to the head shunt only coming from the switch feed at P. The downside was that there was a somewhat unsightly gap in the rails, but I felt that this wouldn't be too noticeable and shouldn't really cause any problem with trains running. Having addressed that problem, I went on to ballast the rest of the track. I put even more brown paint into my glue mix, and you can see it here in the brown patches. But though it made those brown patches, it seemed to have almost no effect at all in respect of actually colouring the ballast. Once the glue on the main ballast had dried, I went on to ballasting the points. I did this by painting on glue with a small brush, avoiding the actual operating mechanisms of the points, and then sprinkling on ballast with my fingers. This was all rather messy and not ideal, but it did succeed in blending the ballasting of the points in with the rest of the track, more or less. I wasn't really at all happy with the results of my ballasting efforts, but this didn't surprise me too much, as this is not the sort of job I'm comfortable with, and I didn't expect to be terribly good at it. I did feel that something had to be done to make the ballasted tracks look more natural, and I felt that some light spray painting was probably the simplest answer, which would also help to weather the rails themselves. I masked a lot of things in preparation for this. I put newspapers taped together over the road and yard areas. I taped over the level crossing and the edges of the shed areas. I also taped over the working areas of the points, as I was afraid that if I sprayed paint there, I'd never get the points to work properly again, especially as regards passing power. I put card all round the sides of the board to protect the back seat and the wall. Then I sprayed over all of the tracks with mudslide brown paint from a rattle can. I wasn't trying to actually paint things completely brown, just to lightly over-tint with brown. I used small pieces of pink insulation foam to wipe over the tops of the rails after spraying each area in an attempt to keep the rail heads clean so they would pass power to locos. Of course, once I took the tape off the points, they showed up very white compared to the brown tinted tracks. On the plus side, the points did seem to be still working properly. To try to blend the points in with the rest of the track, I mixed up a wash of brown enamel paint with some black mixed in and applied this manually with a small brush. This wasn't a perfect solution, but it did blend in the points to a degree. Here's the result after removing all of the masking. Not ideal for sure, but I do think a definite improvement over the effect before the brown painting. Now let's see some video of my testing after all this. Okay, so now I come to more than something of an acid test. After I've spread large amounts of gunk of one sort or another all over it, will my track still work? Now I did just go over it all with my trusty Pico track rubber, which is starting to look pretty dirty itself, but I don't know. I can't even remember. Oh, it goes that way. Well, it is anti-clockwise, isn't it? Okay. We'll change the point there so that he doesn't hit the point, contrary to setting. Well, he's crunching a bit, probably where he's hitting bits of ballast that are where they shouldn't be. And this is a very, very reliable loco. Albeit it is a short wheelbase. Well, I don't like all those crunches, but what can you do? Okay, let's see if we can get him to go across the points. To the other track. I certainly think we still have some problems with bits of ballast where they shouldn't be. Point. Because you can hear there's a distinct tendency to make crunchy noises, which is, as I say, I did go over, I ran a knife blade, a small blunt knife blade all the way around the insides of the inner rails in an attempt to avoid that, in an attempt to remove ballast that was where it shouldn't be up against the inner, because obviously any ballast up against the inside of the rails is going to be a problem, because the flanges of the wheels are going to hit it. Okay, let's try and go into these sidings. I haven't put the buffer back. It's very tricky business. Ooh. Didn't look very good, did it? Hit some piece of business. Ballast there. Whoops. Famous last word. Okay. Let's take him back to the outside again then, if we can. The point's already set. Whoops. He does tend to hesitate a wee bit going across the points, I notice there. Let's try and take him across the points onto the outer sidings. Oops. Didn't something's not working here. He's not getting anything he should be, because this one... Oh, well, I see, there's a serious problem by the looks of it, because whoops, there doesn't seem to be any, power to that siding. There isn't supposed to be power to the other siding. I'm getting confused. Well, there doesn't seem to be any power to either of them. This one should have its own power. Oh, well, I can see it does have its own power supply once you get past. That one has its own power supply once you get... Oh, for goodness sake. This one has its own power supply once you get past the point. But this point seems to be dead now, which is not good. Why is this point dead? Oh well, let's just do the other end and then we'll see. That seems to be okay. But this point seems to be dead. Well, we'll have to investigate that. So I had to bring my soldering station down from the workshop and solder this join, which was a lot harder than I expected, because the solder really does not want. Now this guy has a separate feed from there, so if I turn his feed off now I don't get any movement, but that's the way it's supposed to be. Then as soon as I turn his feed back on, I will get movement. See, I don't know, sorry, I might have had my head in the way. See, there, but if I turn his feed off, no movement. Change the direction, turn the feed back on, and we got movement. Okay, so there we go. So hopefully soldering that join has solved that problem. Why, out of all the various things on the layout, that joint decided to stop transmitting power as a result of the ballasting and weathering process, I don't know, but it did. I think all the rest of the track is now working. Of course, now we've got to put the confounded turntable back in, and that's going to be another whole problem, but one problem at a time. I think the basic track is now essentially ballasted, weathered and working.